Plymouth Harbor, spring 1944. A British admiral stands at his office window. He's coordinated naval operations for 3 decades, seen the Grand Fleet at Scapa Flow, watched Dunkirk. But what he's watching now makes him reach for his desk to steady himself. American ships, hundreds of them, filling every inch of water as far as he can see. And they just keep coming. Hit that like button right now if you want to hear what British commanders actually said when they realized the scale of what America had built. Where in the world are you watching from? Drop your location in the comments. Let me set the scene. It's late 1943. Operation Overlord is in the planning stages, the largest amphibious invasion in human history. British planners have been working on this for months. They understand the numbers. They've approved the allocations. They know America is sending ships. Knowing numbers on paper and watching those numbers materialize in your harbors are entirely different experiences. Admiral Sir Charles Little, Commander-in-Chief Portsmouth, was one of the first to grasp what was happening. His logistics officer brought him the morning report in January 1944. 217 American vessels currently in port, sir. That's not including landing craft still in construction or vessels expected next week. Little had seen the Grand Fleet. He'd watched the evacuation from Dunkirk. He understood naval logistics at a scale most men couldn't imagine. But this was different. The Americans weren't contributing to an invasion fleet. They were building one from scratch, on British soil, faster than seemed physically possible. The first American vessels had arrived in late 1943. A few destroyers, some transports. The advance elements of what would become the Western Naval Task Force under Rear Admiral Alan Kirk. Small numbers initially. By February, the trickle became a flood. Vice Admiral Bertram Ramsay, the Allied Naval Commander-in-Chief for Operation Neptune, maintained headquarters at Southwick House near Portsmouth. Ramsay was meticulous. He'd orchestrated the Dunkirk evacuation. He understood complex naval operations better than almost anyone alive. He'd spent months reviewing ship allocations, planning the choreography, coordinating with American counterparts. The plan called for nearly 7,000 vessels total. The Americans would provide roughly 3,000 of them. Ramsay had written that number countless times, discussed it in meetings with Eisenhower and Montgomery. Coordinated deployment and organization. But watching them actually arrive created a different kind of comprehension. In early March, Ramsay stood on the deck of HMS Largs, his headquarters ship, as an American convoy entered the Solent. He raised his binoculars and started counting. 22 LSTs, landing ship, tank, each capable of carrying 20 Sherman tanks or 33 trucks. Their flat bottoms and bow ramps made them ungainly in rough water. But they could beach themselves, discharge cargo directly onto sand, then retract and return for more. Behind the LSTs came a line of LCIs. Landing craft, infantry, large, each designed to carry 200 troops directly to the beach. Ramsay counted 34 of them. In this single convoy, his flag lieutenant approached with a manifest. Sir, 41 more LSTs scheduled for Plymouth tomorrow. Another convoy of 67 LC is the day after. Ramsay lowered his binoculars. Where are they putting them all? The lieutenant's response became one of the most repeated observations of the entire buildup. Plymouth's reporting they're anchoring them in lines extending 3 miles into the Sound, sir. Falmouth has them packed so tight the harbor master says you could walk from ship to ship across the entire harbor. This was an exaggeration. British port commanders were sending increasingly desperate reports about space. The southern coast of England had become one vast naval parking lot. American vessels filled every available anchorage, every harbor, every inlet deep enough to float a hull. Here, as a question for you. Have you ever watched something grow so fast it stopped making sense? Drop your answer in the comments. The Americans weren't just bringing ships, they were bringing infrastructure. In April, British engineers watched with professional fascination as American Seabees assembled floating piers at Portland. These weren't improvised docks. They were engineered structures, prefabricated in America, shipped in sections, assembled with industrial efficiency that left British engineers shaking their heads. Commander Edward Ellsberg, a British liaison officer working with American forces, wrote in his diary words that captured the mood perfectly. "The Yanks have arrived with enough concrete and steel to build a small city. They're not adapting to our ports. They're building their own." By late April, British civilians found their familiar landscapes transformed. Harbors they'd known their entire lives where they could count the vessels and name half the captains had become forests of masts and superstructures. A fisherman from Weymouth, forbidden from taking his boat out due to military restrictions, stood on the harbor wall and counted American vessels. He reached 300 and gave up. "I've fished these waters 40 years. Never seen anything like it. The water's gone. Just ships now. As far as you can see." Subscribe and turn on notifications because you need to hear what happens when the final numbers come in. The American contribution wasn't just about quantity. It was the types of vessels that revealed the depth of industrial planning. Admiral Sir Philip Vian commanded the Eastern Task Force. His British and Canadian forces would assault Gold, Juno, and Sword Beaches, while Americans took Utah and Omaha. He needed to understand what his American counterparts were bringing. At Plymouth, he boarded USS Nevada. Let me tell you about this ship. Nevada had been sunk at Pearl Harbor, December 7, 1941, struck by one torpedo and multiple bombs during the Japanese attack. She'd settled into the harbor mud with fires burning throughout her superstructure. The Americans raised her, repaired her, modernized her, sailed her across the Pacific through the Panama Canal, across the Atlantic, to support the invasion of Europe. Her 14-inch guns could throw a 1,400-pound shell more than 20 miles inland. The American liaison officer gave Vian the breakdown. "She's one of 3 battleships we're bringing. Texas and Arkansas are at Portland, plus 3 heavy cruisers, 7 light cruisers, 34 destroyers assigned to the Western Task Force alone." Vian did the mental arithmetic. The Americans were bringing more heavy naval gunfire support to their 2 beaches than the entire Royal Navy had available for the 3 British and Canadian beaches combined. Of the 1,213 warships involved in Operation Neptune, 892 were British. Only about 200 were American. But the battleships, the heavy cruisers, the sustained bombardment capacity, that told a different story. And yet the battleships weren't what made the invasion possible. The landing craft were. By late May, the final counts crystallized. The Americans had delivered more than 2,000 landing craft of various types: LSTs, LCIs, LCTs landing craft, a tank, LCVPs, the small Higgins boats that would actually carry troops to the beaches. Each category had subcategories, each designed for specific purposes. The LST Mark II could carry 60 troops and 9 Sherman tanks, or 150 tons of cargo. These vessels could cross the Atlantic under their own power, beach themselves on Dday, discharge their load, retract, and return to England for more. The Americans had built over 1,000 of them during the war. Hundreds were now packed into British harbors. The LCVPs, the Higgins boats, numbered in the thousands. Each carried 36 men or a jeep with crew. They hung from davits on larger ships, ready to be lowered and loaded when the time came. British officers who'd fought in the Mediterranean understood what this meant. At Sicily, at Salerno, landing craft shortages had constrained operations. Forced compromises limited what was possible. For Overlord, there would be no shortage. Captain John Hughes Hallett had been involved in planning since the early days. He stood on a hill overlooking Weymouth Bay in late May. The harbor below held more than 400 vessels. Beyond them, anchored in rows extending to the horizon, hundreds more waited. We kept asking for landing craft. Every planning session, every meeting, The question was always the same. Do we have enough landing craft? He paused. The Americans just kept building them. His colleague had been part of the Dieppe raid planning 2 years earlier. At Dieppe, they'd scraped together enough landing craft for 5,000 men. Most had been destroyed or damaged. The raid was a catastrophe. Now they were planning to land 156,000 men on the first day alone. Here's where the numbers become staggering. The scale of American production was one thing. The speed was another. British industry had been on war footing since 1939. 5 years of rationing, conscription, bombing, total mobilization. British shipyards were building vessels as fast as possible, but they were also repairing battle damage, maintaining existing fleets, dealing with material shortages. American industry had ramped up in half the time. A British logistics officer reviewing production figures found numbers that made him recalculate 3 times. In 1943 alone, American shipyards launched more than 2,000 landing craft of various types. In a single year, they'd built more specialized amphibious vessels than Britain had produced in the entire war. The Liberty ships standard American. Cargo vessels were being completed at a rate of 3 per day across all American shipyards. 3 ships per day. Some yards launched a completed vessel every 4 days from a single slipway. One British officer found the only words that fit. They're not building ships, they're manufacturing them. The difference was more than semantic. American shipyards had adopted assembly line techniques, prefabrication, mass production methods that British yards, with their traditional craftsmanship approaches, couldn't match. The result was visible in every British port by late May 1944. If this industrial scale amazes you, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. Admiral Ramsay held his final planning conference on May 28. More than 100 senior officers crowded into Southwick House. British, American, Canadian, Free French, naval commanders from across the alliance reviewed final dispositions. Ramsay stood before a massive map showing the English Channel and the Normandy coast. Colored pins marked task forces, bombardment groups, transport areas, minesweeper lanes. Gentlemen, the final count. The room went silent. 6,939 vessels, 1,213 warships, 4,126 landing craft, 736 ancillary vessels, 864 merchant ships. He paused, letting the numbers settle. Of these, the American contribution is approximately 3,000 vessels, including the majority of our LSTs and a substantial portion of our specialized landing craft. Every officer present understood naval logistics. They'd spent careers managing fleets, coordinating operations, calculating tonnages and capacities. They knew these numbers represented not just ships, but the industrial capacity of an entire nation bent toward a single purpose. Admiral Sir Harold Burrough spoke up. The last time England assembled a fleet this size was the Armada. And that was to defend against invasion, not launch one. Ramsay nodded slowly. The last time anyone assembled a fleet this size was never. This is the largest naval operation in history. And it's only possible because of American production capacity. In the days before D-Day, British officers made final tours of their sectors. What they saw defied comprehension. Even for men who'd spent their lives at sea. From Portland Bill looking west, the sea was solid with ships. From Portsmouth looking east, the same. The Solent had become a steel channel. Vessels anchored so close, their hulls nearly touched. Every harbor, every anchorage, every protected water on the southern coast held ships. And still they kept arriving. On June 3rd, a convoy of 47 American LSTs entered Plymouth Sound. The harbormaster had been awake 36 hours straight. He stared at his chart. There was no more room. The harbor was full. The Sound was full. Every anchorage was packed to capacity. He ordered them to anchor in a line extending out to sea. bow to stern, creating a floating pier of vessels stretching nearly 2 miles. The Americans complied without complaint. They'd been doing this for months, parking their ships wherever space could be found, waiting for the order to load troops and head south. British troops boarding their assigned vessels in early June found themselves walking past American ships for hundreds of yards before reaching their own transports. The Americans lined the rails, watching the British embark, offering cigarettes and wisecracks and quiet encouragement. A British sergeant leading his platoon up a gangway looked back at the harbor. Ships in every direction, hundreds, thousands, a fleet stretching to the horizon and beyond. Bloody hell, the Yanks really did bring everyone. His corporal had fought in North Africa and Italy. He'd seen American forces arrive in those theaters. They always do, Sarge. They always do. On June 4th, Eisenhower postponed the invasion 24 hours due to weather. 6,939 vessels, many already loaded with troops, waited. British port commanders already stretched beyond capacity now faced keeping this massive fleet organized and supplied for an additional day. Fuel, food, water, medical supplies, ammunition, all had to be distributed to thousands of vessels scattered across dozens of harbors. The Americans had anticipated this. Their logistic ships, supply vessels, tankers already positioned to support the fleet. When British commanders requested additional supplies, American logistics officers simply pointed to their manifests. They'd brought enough for delays, enough for contingencies, enough for scenarios that hadn't been planned. A British supply officer made an observation that cut to the heart of the difference between the two allies. They think in terms of abundance. We think in terms of scarcity. We calculate what we need and try to get it. They calculate what they need and bring twice that much just in case. This wasn't criticism. It was recognition of two military cultures shaped by different national experiences. Britain had fought for 5 years, bombed, blockaded, stretched to its limits. Every resource precious, every ton carefully allocated. American, touched by bombing factories at full capacity, thought differently. They brought excess because they could. They brought redundancy because they had it. They brought overwhelming force because that was how they planned to win. On June 5th, the weather improved slightly. Eisenhower gave the order. Operation Overlord was on. The fleet began to move. British officers watching from shore witnessed something that would stay with them for the rest of their lives. 6,939 vessels, organized into 5 task forces. Each task force divided into groups, each group divided into convoys, all moving south in a choreographed ballet of steel and steam that had taken years to plan and months to position. The American Western Task Force under Admiral Kirk moved first from the western ports. Plymouth, Falmouth, Dartmouth all began emptying their packed harbors. LSTs moved into the channel in long lines. Behind them came transports carrying assault troops for Utah and Omaha. Above them, fire support ships Nevada, Texas, Arkansas took bombardment positions. From eastern ports, British and Canadian forces moved simultaneously. Portsmouth, Southampton, New Haven released their vessels. The channel became a highway of ships, organized into lanes, each lane moving at prescribed speeds, each vessel maintaining exact intervals. Minesweepers went first, clearing 10 channels through German minefields. Behind them came bombardment ships, then transports, then landing craft, then follow-up waves. Admiral Ramsay watched from HMS Largs as the fleet moved past. He'd planned this moment for 18 months, coordinated with dozens of commanders, reconciled thousands of conflicting requirements, integrated British, American, Canadian, French, Polish, and Norwegian vessels into a single coordinated force. His chief of staff spoke quietly. "It's working." Ramsay nodded. "The Americans made it possible. We could never have built this fleet. Not in time, not insufficient numbers. This wasn't diminishing British contributions. British vessels were essential. British planning was critical. British experience in combined operations had shaped the entire plan. But the sheer industrial weight, the overwhelming material abundance that made the plan feasible, that came from America. By dawn on June 6th, the fleet was in position off the Normandy coast. Bombardment ships opened fire at 0550 hours, heavy guns hammering German positions. The sound was continuous, a rolling thunder heard in southern England 80 miles away. British officers commanding their sectors watched the American bombardment with professional appreciation. Nevada fired her 14-inch guns at targets 12 miles inland, each shell creating explosions that sent debris hundreds of feet into the air. Texas and Arkansas systematically destroyed German bunkers and strongpoints. Fire controlled by spotter aircraft, coordinated with incredible precision. Landing craft went in at 0630 hours. Thousands of them, wave after wave, carrying troops to 5 beaches across a 50-mile front. At Utah Beach, the American landing was almost unopposed initially. Troops poured ashore in overwhelming numbers. At Omaha, German resistance was fierce. But the sheer number of American vessels offshore meant that even with heavy casualties, more troops kept coming. More supplies kept landing. More fire support kept hammering German positions. British commanders at Gold, Juno, and Sword had their own battles, their own casualties, their own heroism. But they were also acutely aware that American vessels, American landing craft, American fire support had been allocated to support British sectors as well. By the end of D-Day, 156,000 Allied troops were ashore in France. The invasion had succeeded. Not easily, not without terrible cost, but it had succeeded. In the days and weeks that followed, the fleet continued its work. Landing craft made repeated trips. Reinforcements, supplies, equipment, vehicles. By the end of June, over 850,000 troops had landed in Normandy, along with 148,000 vehicles and 570,000 tons of supplies. The American vessels that had packed British harbors for months were now shuttling across the Channel in continuous operation, bringing the material weight of American industry to bear on Nazi Germany. Admiral Ramsay's final report on Operation Neptune was characteristically precise. The success of the operation was dependent upon the availability of sufficient landing craft and naval vessels to transport and support the assault forces. The American contribution of approximately 3,000 vessels, including the majority of the specialized landing craft, was essential to achieving the required scale of assault. That was the measured language of official reports, in private conversations, in letters home, in memoirs written years later. British officers were more direct. One British captain wrote words that captured what many felt. "We knew they were rich. We knew they had factories and resources we didn't. But knowing it and seeing it are different things." Seeing thousands of ships all built in the last 2 years, it's all brought across the Atlantic, all positioned exactly where they needed to be. That was when you understood what American industrial power actually meant. Another officer put it more simply. "We'd been fighting for 5 years with what we had. The Americans showed up and built what was needed." Different approach, different scale, different kind of war. Final question before we wrap up. What's the most impressive example of industrial scale you've ever witnessed? Drop it in the comments. So what's the lesson here? It's this: scale changes everything. British commanders understood the plan. They'd written the numbers, approved the allocations, coordinated every detail. But there's a gap between understanding numbers and experiencing them, between reading about 3,000 vessels and watching them fill every harbor on the southern coast of England until the water itself disappears beneath hulls. The British had been planning Operation Overlord since 1943, calculating requirements, coordinating forces, preparing for the largest amphibious assault in history. They knew what was needed. They'd done the math. The Americans showed up and exceeded every calculation, brought more than anyone thought possible, made it look routine. That was what British generals saw in spring 1944, not just ships. The physical manifestation of a nation's industrial will, concentrated on a single objective, applied with overwhelming force. They'd asked for an invasion fleet. The Americans delivered an armada that made the Spanish Armada look like a coastal patrol. They'd asked for landing craft. The Americans built them by the thousands and parked them so densely in British harbors that you could walk from ship to ship across entire bays. And watching those ships fill the horizon, British commanders understood something that would define the rest of the 20th century. This was how wars would be won from now on. Not just with courage, not just with strategy, not just with sacrifice. With production, with logistics, with industrial capacity that could build fleets faster than enemies could sink them. If this story changed how you think about D-Day and industrial power, smash that like button right now. Every like tells YouTube to show this to more people who need to understand that sometimes scale is strategy. Subscribe and hit that notification bell, because next week we've got another story about a moment that changed everything, a decision made in seconds that altered the course of an entire campaign. Drop your location in the comments. Tell us about a time when sheer scale made something possible that shouldn't have been. Just let us know you're here. Thank you for watching. And remember, the next time you hear a number that seems impossibly large, remember Plymouth Harbor in 1944. Remember British admirals watching American ships arrive day after day until the sea itself vanished. Remember that sometimes the difference between victory and defeat isn't just courage or strategy. Sometimes it's simply showing up with more than anyone thought possible.